Oopsies daisies. Start it up! What? Oh yeah, the door. Forgot about it. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Hello everyone. Max is here. And this Sienna is actually a race car. Well, it will be a part of a bigger project that I want to share with you. And let me explain everything first. You see, Toyota has made an incredible amount of cars. There is the 2JZ Supra, there is the most reliable and amazing Prius, there's the first gen Tacomas, but one of the greatest cars that I think they've made was an MR2. The whole entire MR2 lineup. And coincidentally, actually, I got one of them. This is a 1991 Turbo Toyota MR2 SW20 chassis code. Okay, we're not that young anymore. I need to grab a chair. Also, pardon the mess around. I'm just doing an organization here, reorganization, so we can get started on this car. And I did not lie. Sienna is considered a race car for this car. The reason is because I am planning to put in a 1MZ FE VVTi engine into this car. This video primarily is going to talk about the three very famous swaps for these cars, which includes the K series, the 2GR FE, and as well as the 1MZ FE or 3MZ FE VVTi. This version will be the 1MZ FE VVTi, which were made as well. I have learned quite a lot of things on the forums and little technicalities with these swaps that I really want to share. Shortly, just before we talk about the differences and the pros and the cons of the 1MZ, 3MZ swap, 2GR and the K swap, I just want to explain that this series is focused on the education aspect and piece of this swap. It's a great, 1MZ is a great, amazing swap, but unfortunately everything that is documented is on the forums, and I found myself being really confused because some of the forums are having one information and they're missing another information. Some of the forums simply don't work because they're very outdated. And another piece is just, I want to share an instructional video that I've noticed other swaps have, and the 1MZ swap is lacking. And now let's get into talking about the plan that we currently have, the idea, and yeah, let's get into it. And I just want to say that I really hope you join me for this journey. So simply put, if you want a regular 1MZ FE non-VVTi, you're just going to look for a simple engine with a simple cable throttle body. If you want the VVTi 1MZ FE and you don't want to mess with the drive-by-wire as well as wiring a throttle pedal and potentially having a late response, you are going to look for the earlier versions of the VVTi 1MZ FE that have the dual throttle bodies. So the VVTi all came, the earlier versions, with a dual throttle body, and that's what you want to get if that's what the route that you're choosing. All right, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the plan. And first of all, I'm going to talk about the different popular options for this swap. And then I'm going to primarily talk about my choice and as well as the details for this choice. Unfortunately, it would not all fit on one board, so we're going to break it down into two. It is very important to start off with a plan. So before we speak about all of these engines, there are a couple things that I want to let you guys know. Basically, no swap is perfect. Regardless if you're going to go the 1MZ, K swap, 2GR, 3VZ, or any other swap, no swap is perfect. They all have their pros and they all have their cons. Now, another important thing when I was planning to do my swap is I needed to include my future goals versus my current goals. Future goals could be, for example, goals that are kind of like maybe 3 to 4 to 5 years down the line. Very important, versus your current goals, because your current goals may be different from your future goals. Then it's important to include your budget now versus your near future, because your budget now may differ than your near future budget. You might have more budget now, or you might have more budget in the near future. Another thing I considered that really helped me figure out my swap was, what do I want? So what do I want from the swap? Do I want a crazy horsepower turbo, 1,000 horsepower vehicle? Or do I want just a little fun little car that I can rip around in summer, that's able to handle well, able to be extremely fun with, limited horsepower. So really important to think and ask yourself, what do I want from this swap? And then what financially makes sense? Of course, it's easy to say, let's just K-swap, 1,000 horsepower, $50,000 build. But is that really financially, does it really make sense now? This is something that I really had to ask myself and figure out what financially makes sense to do versus what financially doesn't make sense, as well as my current goals, my future goals, and everything combined. So to start off, this is also very important. We're starting off with a turbo MR2. The reason I'm specifying that it's a turbo is because it comes with a E153 5-speed manual transmission. Now, if you are having a non-turbo car, it is very important to keep in mind that if you are going to do the E153 swap, or if you're looking at some of these engine options, you will need the E153 swap transmission. In the naturally aspirated engines, it is an S54 transmission, and if you are planning to use the E153 transmission, you do have to get different rear hubs as well as the axles, which are called the turbo axles, because the E153 transmission axles are a little beefier and they're bigger. Thus, you also need the rear knuckles as well if you're going to run the E153. That's why it's important to also figure out what car you have and what you're able to run versus what you're unable to run. So I had a E153 transmission because I had a turbo car with an 3S GTE. This is the same engine as the beans from the Altezza, but the only difference is that it's a turbo version. The other car that this engine came in was a Celica of the same years, and my motor weight is about 385 pounds or about 175 kilograms for this engine with its fluids. So the first swap we're going to talk about briefly is the 3VZFE swap, then the 2GRFE swap, and then the K swap, and specifically the K24A2 swap. And then we're going to talk about the 1MZ FE/3MZ FE with or without the VVTi. And then I'm going to show you the big picture for the 1MZ FE, for what I'm doing, and the technicalities further down the video after we review all of these. So let's start with our 3VZ FE. It is important to note that 3VZ FE is quite an old swap for these vehicles. This motor is actually quite heavy as well. It weighs about 469 pounds or 213 kilograms, which is quite a significant difference from the 3S GTE that was in it previously. Some of the pros of this engine is it comes with an iron block, which is actually very nice if you're planning to turbo the car. You can use a stock ECU from this vehicle as well, which is another pro. It seems to be that when I was reading, it is an easier wiring compared to the 1MZ wiring when you are fusing the wiring harness to your actual chassis. Here you can see you can use a transmission from your NA car. You can use your S54 and it will be able to hold that power of this engine. Now, this is a Pro or a Con, but it's an OBD1 vehicle, which means that for some of the states where you might get smog and your evap stuff, the OBD1 kind of basically gets rid of it. There's less things to worry about with the OBD1. Another cool thing about it is that it's a 3-liter naturally aspirated engine from Toyota. It, again, as mentioned, it's able to handle the boost because of that iron block and overall just the rigidity of that block. It is a cheaper engine. You can find them, if you find these vehicles at the local junkyards, and you're paying whatever you're paying for that engine. Another pro is that it is similar to the 1MZ swap, and 1MZ swap is considered to be on the cheaper side of a swap for this vehicle, so that is another pro. Another pro is the availability. Again, there were quite a few cars that came with these engines, and some countries may actually be able to get a 3VZ FE easier than, for example, a 1MZ. So that's why I put the availability there. And another pro is it's a V6, and it sounds pretty cool. However, the cons of this engine, Unfortunately, it only pushes 185 horsepower. Now, that does sound like a lot for an MR2. However, with our other options here, this does become quite a low number. Another con is that it's an OBD1. As mentioned, the pro is that there's less sensors, less things to worry about. However, with the OBD1, you kind of have to count the amount of time that your check engine light flickers. For some people, it's just easier to get that OBD2 and figure out sensors and whatnot. So it's either a pro or a con, depends how you look at it. Another con, it is quite similar to a 1MZ swap, and that's why 3VZ FE hasn't really been that popular now ever since we got more swap options. This is one of those swaps that really was there from the beginning. It is quite slow, considering that it's 185 horsepower. It is quite a heavy block as well. It is quite a slow engine. I mean, it's obviously beats walking, but it is something to keep in mind. In terms of the old swap, this is an issue because if you're looking at any forums, if you're looking at other things, there's quite limited information on actual forums that still work because people just no longer really do those swaps. Another con is because it's similar to 1MZ, there's really not much of a point in doing the 3VZ swap because there is that 1MZ that's readily available now as well. Another con is if you don't have a transmission, you will need to find the transmission, either the S54 or the E153. And another con is obviously the weight. This is quite a heavy block. And a couple things with this engine. Apparently they are prone to some head gasket issues where they love to blow them. And then with increased mileage, they do get an increase in the rod bearing wear. And as well as you need to modify the harnesses of your current engine to this engine, and that's a con because unless you're able to find another harness, you need to modify your own harness, and then if you want to ever do another different swap, you do need to find a new harness for it, or you just, I guess, undo everything and hope for the best. Now let's move to our 2GR-FE swap. With our 2GR-FE swap, this is quite a popular swap right now, right beside a K-swap if you have the budget. The pros is the fact that there's a lot of vehicles that came with this engine. There's a plethora of cars that all have this motor. It is known to be quite available, quite reliable. It is a little bit pricier still, so you could expect to pay probably about twice as much for the 2GR-FE from someone parting it out, unless you buy a parts car, than you would for the 3VZ or the 1MZ. So just something to keep in mind as part of your budget. The cool thing about it is that it's a 3.5 liter NA engine, which is quite big, quite a big V6 in a little MR2. Another pro is that it's better overall. It is better overall technology-wise, consumption-wise, horsepower-wise over the 3VZ as well as the 1MZ. The 3VZ comes in much of the older cars, and then the 3MZ kind of started showing up, and then the 2GR started showing up. Very important is for this swap that the 2GR-FE is the only engine that can be put into these cars, and that's the engine that the aftermarket is being built for. Nice thing is that you can use your stock ECU with it. You can get it flashed to remove the immobilizer on it, I believe. Then another cool thing about this swap is the fact that there's so many documents out there that are talking about how to do this swap. Literally, if you type into Google 2GR into SW20 MR2, which is the chassis number, which is that second generation of MR2, you will find a couple links. For example, the Grassroots Motorsport did this swap and documented it. The Frankenstein Motorworks even talks about the budget of this swap and how much you need. Now, overall, another pro is that it's a decent engine. It's a very good Toyota, good old reliable Toyota Lexus V6 engine that when you make to the manual transmission is just a beautiful engine to use. I mean, incredible support, again, you can find a lot of DIY stuff for these engines, although still things do end up adding up for these little guys. But there's a lot of support for this engine. It's almost basically as close as a K-swap in terms of swappability. Now, another cool thing about the 2GR-FE is the VVT. So you can play around with your, variable valve timing, which is really cool. Another cool thing about this engine is that naturally aspirated, it produces somewhere over 268 horsepower, give or take. I've read somewhere on some forums where people are easily pushing 300 wheel on stock internals for this engine. Obviously tuned, but there is quite a lot of possibility for this motor. Supposedly it is also easily tunable. You can tune it quite easily with using a proper ECU. It enjoys to be tuned. It is not one of those where it's, as soon as you give it a tiny bit, it blows up. Another cool thing is that it's obviously a V6. Again, those cool V6 noises, just amazing. And then this swap is very closely related or could be considered as an OEM plus option. So if you want a little bit more power, I guess we're not really a little bit more, but quite a substantial amount of power, then you can get this kind of OEM plus feel to your MR2 by still keeping it Toyota. There's quite a lot of cons for this engine, and a lot of them are down to budget basically. First of all, actually, is the drive-by-wire. So this engine does not have a cable throttle body. It has basically a throttle body that has a sensor motor on a receiver that basically uses electronics to control however much it opens. This is known to cause some delays in response, and for some people it is very noticeable. So this is something to keep in mind. Apparently this engine is also prone to oil leaks. Loves leaking oil. There is an additional install that you need to do, which is fusing the wiring harnesses, installing that drive-by-wire, which requires you to have a separate gas pedal that has that sensor in it as well. Another thing is, unfortunately, you cannot use the S54 transmission, which comes in the NA MR2. You do have to have a turbo MR2 or the E153 transmission, the beefier axles, as well as the beefier knuckles in the rear, the hubs to put the actual transmission and the axles in. So this is a big thing. If your car is NA, this is something to consider, that you will need parts from the turbo MR2. Another con is the cost. Regardless of how cheap you're trying to keep this thing, it will run you into at least about probably $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. Really just depends on how much you're willing to spend and how much you're willing to do of your own work. There is quite a lot of bolt-on stuff that the Frankenstein Motorworks, and as well as this other company that the Frankenstein Motorworks was talking about, that sell a lot of the bolt-on stuff, but unfortunately it adds up very, very quickly for this swap. So another con is the parts. So because it's still quite a new motor, some of the parts are still kind of expensive-ish for this motor specifically. For example, getting that flywheel and whatnot, and the clutch, because these never came in manual, you do need to make some adjustments to those things. Just something to keep in mind. Another con, again, same with the 3MZ, you do need to modify your harness. So again, you're going to splice into your harness, and just keeping that in mind, that if you are ever wanting to do another swap, you will have to either revert your harness back or get another harness. Another con is you need an ECU to tune. So if you do want to fully unlock the capabilities, there are ECUs that you can purchase for this engine. However, again, that adds up to the cost. Thus this makes this swap quite pricey in that way. Now I included the mobilizer here because although it can be programmed out of some cars, this is something that you do have to deal with this engine, unfortunately, is the mobilizer. And as I mentioned, no S54 transmission from the NA MR2. The actual motor weight for this engine, it is 366 pounds or 166 kilograms, which is, again, lighter than our stock 3S GTE that was in the car. So this was quite a viable option for me when I was looking at the MR2 swap and what I want out of it. However, let's move on to our K-swap and talk a little bit more about it. Our lovely K-swap. Whenever you talk about an MR2 and swapping an engine, everybody always says, why don't you K-swap it? Why don't you do this? Why don't you K-swap it? There are a lot of issues with swapping, putting a K engine into the MR2. One of those biggest downsides is the fact that you need a K24A2. Now, this engine specifically you need because It is so 24 stands for the displacement, so the K20 would be like 2 liter, K22 is 2.2, K24 is 2.4. Now, this engine is the only engine that came with that dual VTEC, and unfortunately, realistically, it only came in the RSXs and the TSXs. Now, because it only came in these two cars, this engine is extremely expensive. And also, if you do want a 6-speed transmission, because you can't use any of these transmissions mentioned here, the Toyota ones, you use the K-Series transmission. You can use the 5-speed transmission, which I will talk about, but the 6-speed is only in these cars. The reason you want the K24 as well is because there were some additional designs, like they increased the size of the throttle body, they made the strong connecting rods, and they're just overall a little bit of an improvement in the overall engine design. So some pros is the huge support. You know, K-Swap is huge for a bunch of different cars, but K-Swap is also expensive, keeping in mind. It is reliable, it's a Honda, it's a K-Series, it is extremely reliable, it can handle boost, it can handle NA especially, just a reliable engine. There is quite a lot of, in terms of availability of them, that is only if you're focusing on other motors and not the K24, which I will talk about. There are direct drop-in kits that are available. They are pricey, but they are available. You can buy a kit for about $3,000 and directly drop a K motor into your MR2. There is a huge turbo support for this engine, which is lovely. Again, if you want that 1,000 horsepower MR2, this is the way to go. Now, another pro is there's 5 speeds available for this engine all day long. With the K-Series, every transmission works with every engine. So if you ever blow up your transmissions somehow, you can just go to a local junkyard and pick up yourself a 5-speed transmission out of any car without any issues. Now, another pro is the engine bay space. Because this is not a V6, but an inline 4, it is similar size to our 3S, which makes it very nice and compact. Another pro is that it got VTEC. So with the K-Series, you get that VTEC that you can play around, similar, basically the same thing as the VVTi. So the one thing that kind of stood out for me when I was looking at this is a pro and a con. So with it naturally aspirated, you get a 160 to 205 horsepower. Now that 160 comes from usual like CRV engines and the K-Series engines that came in different cars like the Civics and whatnot. However, that 205 horsepower engine is that TSX motor, which unfortunately costs quite a lot of money by itself, which is an issue when it comes to actual availability of the engine. So the con that I talked about here is being 160 to 205 horsepower. Naturally aspirated, when you're putting all that money into it, this is kind of the ballpark of horsepower that you're basically going to see, unless you're slapping another thousands of dollars on the turbo swap or turboing the car. So with the actual money that it takes to put a K-Series, naturally aspirated K-Series into your MR2, you're talking very close to the GRFE money, if not slightly more. This is why it's important to figure out, what do you want? Do you want just a naturally aspirated go-kart, or do you want a insane horsepower turbo K-swap? Now, put again the dollar signs, because it is very, very expensive. The engine by itself can easily run you $1,000 to $1,500, and as well as the 6-speed transmission, because again, the availability of it. Now, another con is that they did come with drive-by-wire. Now, you can solve this by getting an adapter plate, but that also goes back into the budget. Another thing is, presumably, usually you end up getting a Honda, which is a standalone ECU for these cars, because you're able to tune them a little better, and again, you're not dealing with the immobilizer issue. So another thing to keep in mind. We talked about the 6-speed is being pricey again. Now, the turbo MR2 is actually needed because of the axles and the hubs for the E153 transmission. You actually need those hubs again for this swap to work. If you buy the kit that I've talked about right about here, the axles will come for the turbo MR2 hubs. Now, again, another thing is you do need to modify your harness, so just something to keep in mind. And some of the cons of this engine are the oil leaks, and as well as chain tensioner and the chain itself. So there's really not much, because if you're removing the engine, you're probably overhauling it anyways. And now, last but not least, let's talk about our 1MZ FE and 3MZ FE swap. Alrighty, so After looking into all of these swaps, I really didn't look much into the 3VZ FE swap due to the 1MZ being available. And then I was thinking maybe the K swap or the 2GR swap. After doing some calculations, I realized that I will be spending probably close to somewhere around about $7,000 to $8,000 for this swap to be NA for a couple years, because I realized that I'm not planning to boost this car anytime soon. And then I realized and I thought about it, well, why not do the 2GR FE swap, because it's actually slightly bit cheaper, give or take. However, the issue was I realized I don't want to do any of those. I think I'll be more than happy with the horsepower that the 1MZ and the 3MZ have to offer. First, I will just quickly talk about these guys and why they're together, and then I will actually break it down for you, the actual formalities of this engine. So the pros is the price. This engine, the 1MZ FE, can be found at the junkyard all day long. They're really everywhere. They came in so many cars throughout the years that they're just everywhere. The horsepower is really interesting as well, because you get around 190 to 234 horsepower. This is kind of like the 3MZ version, and this is the NA 1MZ FE version. The VVTi played a little bit of a role later on, which we will talk about. So I thought about it, well, you know, considering the availability and the price of the engine and all the services that I'm going to utilize, 190 horsepower for what I will be into this motor is pretty good. Now, availability, again, if this thing ever blows up or something happens, they're readily available. The versatility is really nice because a lot of the parts from the 1MZ bolt up to the 3MZ, if you ever wanted to go the 3MZ route, they're actually identical. It's just the bigger displacement for this guy and the VVTi. It is supposedly a pretty straightforward swap. There is unfortunately not as much write-ups or I guess videos as there is for the 2GR. There's not that many video tutorials or write-ups about this guy as there is about the 2GR. However, the swap seems to be pretty straightforward, and the things I was able to find made sense and how to do it, so that's why I'm doing it. Another pro is it's actually feasible and pretty logical to get a parts car for yourself for this entire swap, due to the amount of engines and cars that these came in. Now, you can use a S54 or the E153 transmission with this swap. The only thing is S54, the way it lines up, I think it lines up, it's missing one transmission bolt or two out of the total amount, but the E153 appears to line up quite perfectly with the engine. Now, another pro is that some of these guys came with the VVT, which again gives you that, if you're staying the naturally aspirated way, gives you a little bit more torque and horsepower. And then another pros, which I already mentioned, is the interchangeable parts between the 1MZ and the 3MZ. They're basically these are the only two that came in the cars. Unlike with the 2GR, there were different versions of them which parts don't work onto, but with the 1MZ and 3MZ, they basically swap right over. Now with the cons, so it is not worth boosting. Unfortunately, these don't really hold boost as much. There is a TRD supercharger that you can buy for the 1MZ FE. However, the supercharger costs basically the same as this entire swap is supposed to cost you. These are very rare, and when they come for sale, people are asking about $3,000, $4,000 for these guys. So it's really not worth getting that extra, 10, 15 horsepower. I've heard somewhere people were getting about 40 horsepower out of the supercharger, but for that money, it's really not worth it. Now, another con is that it's a bulky V6. Again, a pro is that it's a V6, those noises and whatnot, but it is quite bulky. Same with the 2GR. There is not really much space to do much in the car when the engine isn't there due to the size of that motor. And another con for these engines, notorious, is the fact that it has sludge buildup. So this engine, if not maintained, loves to build up sludge, which again, kind of, if you're putting a motor into your MR2, you're obviously planning to use it for its intended purpose, is to have fun. So if you have that sludge buildup, it really creates difficulties. Good thing though is this engine is only about 337 pounds or 153 kilos, which is the 1MZ, which is actually lighter than the stock 3S GTE. However, it goes up to, with the 3MZ, goes up to 453 pounds or 205.5 kilos with the extra VVTi and the different intake and whatnot. It kind of just adds up a little bit of weight. However, if you are getting 230 horsepower versus the OEM, it is quite close, and I think it's worth it. And now let's actually talk about the 1MZ and 3MZ in greater detail. All right, everyone. So this is now the details of the 1MZ FE and the 3MZ FE swap. So because the 3MZ FE is getting older and there are more cars that end up at the junkyard, I realized that I want to put the 3MZ in the car, considering that they're an identical block on the outside. So I want the 3MZ because increased horsepower, it has the 3.3 liters versus just the 3 liter, and the availability, again, every 3MZ FE that is at the junkyard has the VVTi, and it's basically the same engine. It has up to 240 horsepower, which is quite an increase from the 1MZ, and they all have the VVT. The issue with the 1MZ is the fact that we're going to talk about this part in one moment, because I want to first cover what I need for the swap for the 1MZ and the 3MZ, and then I'll talk to you about my reverse engineering there real quick. So first of all, I need is the engine mount, which I will be getting from Paul Woods, because the transmission bolts right up. I don't need to worry about the transmission side, but for the engine, there is an engine mount that Paul Woods sells on his website, and it is 125 pounds. The harness service, again, I will be talking to Paul Woods regarding this. He offers a harness service where he takes the 3SGTE harness and the 1MZ FE harness and he mates them together so that when you get the harness back, it's directly a plug-and-play harness for you. And that is going to cost me 475 pounds, because the last thing I want to do is mate some wires wrongfully and something not working. I'd rather a professional do this for me. Considering for the whole entire swap, this does not look like an awful price either. Then another thing I need to do is actually I need to modify the axle bearing, the one that the load bearing one. On the actual 1MZ engine, it sticks about 1/4 of an inch a little further out, and you just need to supposedly make a little shave down a little piece of it to 1/4 of an inch so that it sits flush. However, recently a gentleman on the forums replied back to me and told me that he used a 2005 Sienna axle bearing that apparently doesn't have the motor mount, which apparently directly works with the E153. However, it doesn't work with the S54, so if you have the S54 transmission, it will not work. But supposedly it works with the E153, and I will be checking this because this is going to be a game changer if this does work. Obviously, while the engine is out, I will be doing some basic maintenance to it. Then I also need to buy a 1MZ flywheel for a manual Camry. Any flywheel will work, and then supposedly I can use my stock MR2 turbo clutch. So again, we will see how all of this works. So with the 3MZ FE, the things that I wanted to minimize and make this swap as easy as I possibly can. So I know that this is a VVT harness because they all came with VVT. And then I also know that the 1MZ FE also came with VVT at one point, which means that when I get the 1MZ harness, because that is the harness that Paul offers the harness service for, I will be able to put it right onto the 3MZ FE without any issues. The only thing is that there is a knock sensor that I need to address at one point, which when the 3MZ will go into the car at one point, this has to be addressed and look further into. However, because I was able to get the donor car with the VVT 1MZ, for now I'm just going to put that engine into the car and run like that. So the earlier versions of the 1MZ FE with the VVT came with a dual throttle body intake, which actually bolts up directly to the 3MZ. The reason is that you want to do this is because this dual throttle body intake is actually cable driven. And because you can take the intake off of the 1MZ and put it onto your 3MZ, you're able to put those throttle bodies from this intake onto your 3MZ and thus get rid of the drive-by-wire throttle body. And you don't have to wire anything extra for that. So you just take the intake and you put it onto this thing. Now, the VVT plugs and whatnot from the 1MZ supposedly work and plug in directly to the VVT on the 1MZ, which means that this is no longer an issue. Now, because this intake is a VVT intake, and because I mentioned that it bolts up straight to the 3MZ, you don't have to worry about the 3MZ intake and its drive-by-wire throttle body, so you can get rid of that as well. The knock sensor is the only thing that is left that will be figured out when I do put the 3MZ into the car. But for now, the 1MZ is what you need and what you're getting. Another very important thing is that when you're getting your engine, when you're getting actually your ECU and the harness, these need to come from the same car. The harness and the ECU, the engine harness and the ECU need to come from one car, because apparently the pinouts are a little different. So for example, if you were to ask Paul for the help and utilize this service, he does require that the harness and the ECU come from one car. This is exactly another reason why it makes sense to get a donor car. Another reason to get a donor car is actually the VVT engines are hard to come by. There's none at the junkyard. Whenever they come to the junkyard, they usually get pulled. So if you're doing just the regular 1MZ without the VVT, then you can just disregard this and they're at the junkyard all day long. But why would you do that when you can get the VVT and you have to pay the same amount for this service? You might as well get the VVT, get that extra horsepower, and potentially be able to put the 3MZ with the same 1MZ harness, the dual throttle bodies, and the intake. Why not? So the reason it makes sense to get a donor car is because there are plethora of these cars available and they all come differently equipped. Some of them came with a mobilizer, some of them didn't. Some of these cars came with a VVT, some of them didn't. Very important that when you're looking for a donor car, you ask for the pictures of the engine bay. The 1MZ FE with the VVT in the early models is where it came with the throttle body, dual throttle body intake and the dual throttle bodies. The later versions came with the drive-by-wire, which again, you can adapt, but if you can minimize that headache and that latency, why not just get the dual throttle bodies that are cable driven? So your goal is, if you're looking for the VVT swap, you want to ask for the photos of the engine bay and confirm that what they have is the VVT. The engine cover is a very shiny silver engine cover, which I showed in the previous clip of my Sienna, that literally has the VVT written on it, so you'll never go wrong. It's difficult to tell if the engine is VVT or not if there's no cover, unless you look further in and you're able to see the dual throttle bodies. If you can see the dual throttle bodies, that means it's an earlier version of the 1MZ VVT, and that is what you need. Now for my donor car, I'm also going to be using the ECU and the harness and shipping that to Paul with my 3S GTE harness. So the problem was mitigated, and as well as this was mitigated because I got the engine. My car did come with a mobilizer, and he actually asks you to take all of the mobilizer stuff out. If you call the local dealership and ask if your car has the mobilizer and sending you the diagrams, I had no issue getting my diagrams and then just figuring out the part numbers that are in the diagrams and to know what to look for. It is actually not that bad at all to find this. Another positive with the donor car is that you get the cats, which you can sell and buy the eBay catalytic converters for the car if you want, or sell these and make your own pipes and whatever, make your own piping for the exhaust if you don't live in the smog areas. So you can kind of actually recoup some money back by selling these cats. And my van was only $650. So even if I don't recoup anything from this van, my engine, which is a VVT engine, which is already pretty rare, plus the ECU, plus the harness, was $650. Now with these services and obviously some little things that I need to buy, it doesn't look that bad. So financially wise, this swap so far does make sense, and I will keep you guys updated and we will see how it actually turns out. I really hope that I was able to make everything as straightforward and as clear as mud. It took me a lot of hours to combine all of this information and really figure out the differences with the 1MZ and the 3MZ and what can be bolted up and whatnot. We still have that knock sensor to figure out, but that is an issue for when the engine would actually go into the car. For now, because I got the donor car with the VVT, I will be putting that 1MZ into this vehicle, and then when the time comes, I will just swap over the VVT stuff onto the 3MZ and throw over the 1MZ harness onto the 3MZ. And I'm really looking forward to this swap, and I'm really looking forward to documenting every detail so that somebody can just look it up on YouTube and get the clear understanding of how it's done. So if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to leave those in the comments. I would love to get your input and your insight into this. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.